So thank you very much, Courtney, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the COVID-19 epidemic, its impact on China, and then the second order impacts throughout the world. As Courtney mentioned, I run a economic research service. Our headquarters in Hong Kong, and we have a team there that covers global macroeconomic and market issues. And then we have another team of 8 people in Beijing who study the Chinese economy intensively. And for the last 2 months, basically our team in China has been doing nothing but trying to understand the impact of the epidemic on China's economy and society. And for the last couple of weeks, basically the global team has been doing the same thing. And I've been spending a lot of my personal time trying to get a handle on the welter of data that's been coming out. And analytically, I think the problem that we face is that the amount of information that is out there about this epidemic has exploded even more exponentially than the epidemic itself. And most of that data is fairly low quality. So you find yourself digging through a pretty enormous haystack to find a few needles of good information. But what I want to do today is touch on 3 things, basically. First of all, how has the epidemic played out in China, and what does that tell us about how it's likely to play out here, both in terms of the disease itself and the responses to it? Second, what are the economic consequences of this in China and the rest of the world? And then third, what are the longer term implications of that? So on the first point, basically what happened in China was that the disease broke out in Wuhan at some point in the first half of December. There was a very poor response initially, some fumbling by the local health authorities, and some cover-ups by the central government. The result was that you had a very severe outbreak in the city of Wuhan, in central China and surrounding areas. And on January 23rd, right before the Chinese Lunar New Year, the central government sort of acknowledged that the scale of the problem, effectively quarantined Wuhan and most of the province that it was in, Hubei, cutting it off from the rest of the country, and instituted very severe social distancing measures and travel restrictions throughout the entire country. So the initial response was slow, but then there was a very vigorous response afterwards. The result of this was that after imposing these quarantines and social distancing measures on January 23rd, was that the pace of the epidemic was slowed down dramatically. And within about 2 weeks, you saw a real flattening of the curve, as we say, a reduction in the rate of growth of cases to very low levels outside of Hubei. Within Hubei, where the epidemic was already established, you had a slower response, but still within about 3 to 4 weeks, there was a very dramatic reduction in the spread of the epidemic. The other thing that resulted from this was that if you look at the fatality rates, which are the number of people who die from the disease divided by the number of reported confirmed cases, within Hubei itself, that fatality rate is almost 5%. In the rest of China, it's under 1%. Now, I should caveat this by saying the fatality rates, as you probably know, are very complicated. What you really want to know is how many people die relative to how many are infected, which is a much larger number than the reported number of cases. It's very hard to get that data, so we're stuck looking at deaths over confirmed cases. But the key point in China is that the social distancing measures that you saw had a dramatic impact and a very rapid impact. Within days, you could actually start to see material slowdown in the acceleration of the virus spread. And within 2 or 3 weeks, really, really dramatic reductions in the spread. And the difference between getting to it early outside of Hubei and getting to it late in Hubei was also very important, right? Because they controlled the virus late within Hubei, which meant that it lasted longer and the fatality rate was much, much higher. Whereas in the rest of the country where the virus had not spread nearly so much, they distanced early, put in the social controls early, and resulted in a much quicker exit from the rapid spread of the epidemic and a dramatically lower fatality rate. So those are the key facts, I think, that we know from the epidemic control within China. The downside of this was a dramatic contraction in economic activity. And in China, they were lucky in a sense in that they chose to do this massive countrywide lockdown just as the country was going into the Lunar New Year period, which is about a 2-week period during which there's very little economic activity. A lot of factories and offices close. People leave the big cities, go back to smaller towns or villages to be with their families. There's a lot of eating and drinking, but very little other economic activity. So there was a kind of a normal seasonal slowdown that would have occurred anyway. And what the government did is said, okay, this slowdown that's normal, we're going to make it deeper and we're going to make it last longer. So for a month, basically, the entire month of February, people were staying at home, they were not going back to work, and most economic activity was effectively stopped. Starting in late February, the governments began to encourage people in certain regions to get back to work, get the economy going. You saw an acceleration of activity through March. But even today, at the beginning of April, which is more than 2 months after the initial lockdown orders went into place, we estimate that the economy is operating at about 75% normal levels. And that's obviously, so effectively you had 1 month of completely lost output in February. You had another month in March where probably on average, you are operating at something like 40 or 50% of normal. And in April, we anticipate that over the course of April, gradually, we may be able to get up to something close to a full capacity. So we won't be back to anything approaching normal, really, throughout China, I don't think, until the end of April. And when you translate that into economic growth, what that means is that China's GDP, which had been growing at about 5 or 6% for the last couple of years, is probably now growing at minus 5 or 6% for the first half of the year. So that's a negative swing of 10 percentage points in GDP growth. It is a massive economic shock, and the government is only now starting to put in place support measures through central bank monetary policy and fiscal spending to ease the burden. Okay, so that's what's happened in China. If we translate this to what is happening right now in the US and Europe, basically the US and European countries are gradually moving into doing the same things that China did all at once at the end of January. And they're doing it at a much later stage of the epidemic. So China really had one big hotspot. The US has a big hotspot in New York, but it also has a lot of other little hotspots. So the virus spread is much more extensive, and that's also true in most countries in Europe. So the kinds of social distancing, travel restrictions, et cetera, controls that we're seeing in the US are pretty similar to what China was doing, but we're implementing them piecemeal at a later stage of the epidemic. And so I think the consequence of this is you will start to see, and you can already see in the data, that these distancing measures are starting to have an impact in reducing the rate of spread of the virus. This is already visible. But we've still got, I think, 2 months of fairly severe controls on what people can do and where they can go and how they can meet um, before any state government in the U.S. or any national government in Europe is going to feel comfortable lifting these. It will vary by region, and there may be some sparsely populated areas of the United States that can get this under control earlier and start to lift restrictions sooner. But I think we have to expect that a pretty high level of social distancing, social control, et cetera, is going to be in place definitely through April and probably in most places through much of May. And the economic consequences we can see are pretty devastating. We've seen unemployment claims go to unprecedented levels. There are all kinds of estimates of the GDP impact, which are measured in different ways. You get all different kinds of numbers. But broadly speaking, I think it is very clear that at least for the first half of the year in the United States, economic growth is going to suffer probably the biggest short-term hit since the Great Depression. It will be significantly larger hit to growth than we saw in 2008 and 2009. And I think the experience that we've seen in China, that you had this massive shutdown and then things slowly came back, and it was really, we're looking at a kind of a 2-month recovery process in China to normal economic levels. I think that's probably what you're looking at here as well. It's not terrific news, and I think you've all been reading the headlines and seeing that the federal government has been responding pretty aggressively, both in terms of the Federal Reserve reducing interest rates to 0 and pumping a lot of other credit into the system, and the federal government providing a lot of stimulus. I think more is going to be necessary, and it's clearly going to be a long slog. Okay, so that I think is the short view of how this played out in China, how it's going to play out here. I'd like to spend my last 5 minutes talking a little bit about what are the longer term implications of this. And I think there are really 2 things that I would focus on. One is that alarmingly, this virus, I think, has provided an occasion for the rift between China and the United States, which has already been, quite noticeable over the last couple of years. This rift is widening rather than narrowing. So instead of taking the view that, oh, this is a humanitarian crisis, the governments just have to put aside their differences and work together to reduce the physical harm to people. There's been a lot of blame shifting. There's been an intensification of distrust on both sides. And I think we've seen this crystallize in the last couple of days. You may have seen a headline about an intelligence report in the United States that purports to show that China has been falsifying its numbers on how many people were infected and how many people died of the epidemic after February. And I think this is likely to be more or less true. It is analysts like myself who've been looking at the Chinese data. The downward slope that you see in February and early March is a little bit suspiciously smooth. And we know also that many cases of this disease, people do not show any symptoms. WHO requests that countries report even asymptomatic cases in their total caseloads. And we know that China has not been doing that. China has admitted that they do not count asymptomatic cases in their caseload. So the true caseload is probably quite a bit higher. The death rate may be slightly higher. I think that's a little bit harder to fudge. But the conclusion that a lot of people in Washington have drawn from this is, look, the Chinese messed up early. They kind of concealed in December and early January the extent of the virus. This created some damage internationally. And then even after it became an international issue, they lied about their numbers, and so we can't trust them at all. And so this has really hardened a narrative that China is a deeply untrustworthy regime, and that the US really, according to many, an increasing number of people in foreign policy and defense positions in Washington, this is a justification for edging towards essentially a Cold War type of attitude towards China. That train is moving very quickly. And I think that's unfortunate because while I think there are clearly a lot of issues and problems between China and the US, I think the degree of economic interdependence and the sophistication of the economic relationships between the two countries mean that a Cold War like we had with the Soviet Union is just not practicable. And talking that way is, in my view, extremely dangerous. But the center of gravity in Washington is moving very rapidly to a much more hardline view. This was happening before the epidemic, and I think the epidemic is intensifying it. When you look at the Chinese perspective on this, they have been focused until recently on containing the epidemic domestically. But now that they think they have it more or less under control, they're focusing a lot on messaging both at home and abroad. The messaging at home is, we did a great job, we got the population mobilized under the wise leadership of the Communist Party, we took on this great challenge and we won. And so that kind of bolsters the legitimacy of the party domestically, despite the various missteps that they made. And then internationally, they're trying to make the case that, look, we can show people how to deal with these things. We're competent. You look at the response in the US and Europe, it's much less competent. This is further validation of the Chinese model. And in addition to those claims, which I think are, reasonable, I don't necessarily agree with them, but they're reasonable claims for them to make under these circumstances. But on top of that, you have Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespeople publicly at briefings espousing wild and unsupported conspiracy theories about how this virus actually originated in the United States and so forth. So you have a publicity campaign, a messaging campaign out of Beijing that has some, I think, quite seriously valid elements to it, but is also mixed in with a lot of much less savory stuff. So I think bottom line, and this is where I will conclude, is that as we look ahead, not only are we going to have this problem of getting the epidemic under control and getting our economy back on track, which is a massive set of projects, but we also have this brewing problem of a US-China relationship, the relationship between the two biggest economies in the world, which is getting substantially worse as a result of this due to actions from both governments. And we really have a critical need at this point, I think, for mature and sensible people on both sides to try and inject themselves more into the conversation and establish a more constructive basis for U.S.-China relationship in the months and years ahead. So I'll stop there, and I guess it's time to open it up for questions. And Courtney, how do you want to handle this? I see one question in the Q&A, which I can just answer if you like.
Sure, great, go for it. Yep, that's easy. And then I know we have a question coming in via email. So
okay, all right.
Yeah.
So okay, so the question is, the U.S. stimulus package is about 10% of GDP. Britain has pledged to make loans of 15% of GDP. Why are Chinese fiscal measures so far only less than 1% of its GDP? Right, so those numbers are about right. The basic idea is you've had massive stimulus programs in the US and Europe to offset the economic damage of the social controls. This has not happened in China. Why? I think there are two reasons for this. First, China policymakers have an experience of doing a very large and uncoordinated fiscal stimulus in 2008 and 2009 after the global financial crisis. And while some stimulus was clearly necessary, the way that it was done resulted in a vast increase in debt and risk-taking behavior in China. And policymakers there think that that was kind of a mistake. And they've spent the last several years trying to control the debt level in the economy with a great deal of success. And they do not want to go back to the problem that was created in 2008 and 2009. So the institutional bias of Chinese policymakers today is very, very conservative, and much more conservative than it was 5 or 10 years ago because of these struggles that they've had containing the debt from the last stimulus. That's one reason. I think the second reason is that they just underestimated the economic impact domestically, and they also didn't account for the fact that the rest of the world is going to go into a big recession. This is going to drive Chinese exports down probably by anywhere from 20 to 60% in the coming months. And I think they just didn't account for that. They assumed once we contain the virus at home, it'll be fine. There won't be a problem anywhere else in the world, and we'll go back to normal. And so now you're beginning to see them come out with more aggressive measures. But even so, I don't think that they're likely to match the measures that you see in the US and Europe because they're so concerned about the debt problem. Okay, so I see a couple of other questions here, which I can address. Courtney, is there one coming in from email?
Yes, I do have one from email, and that
so
is if you. Oh,
why don't
sorry?
we take that one? Why don't we take that one, and then I'll go back to the Q&A here.
Terrific, terrific. So, so the email question is: do you think that U.S. reliance on vital health products manufactured in China, such as face masks, PPE, prescription drugs, etc., will lead to further decoupling and move such manufacturing back to the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. First of all, what I'd like to stress is that there are some stories out there that, you know, it's impossible to get stuff from China, or the stuff that you get is low quality. And these are kind of a distortion of the truth. There's actually a massive effort going on by Chinese manufacturers and provincial governments to mobilize production of this stuff and get it to the US. And you probably may have seen a story in the Wall Street Journal today about how Mass General Hospital in Boston got a load of, you know, millions of masks using the New England Patriots private airplane. So it's a kind of a jury-rigged situation, but there is, I think, a very strong good faith effort among local governments and manufacturers in China to get this stuff made and ship it to where it's needed, right? But there are a lot of bottlenecks, and it's really hard to make it happen, right? And so, yes, I think no question, once this is done, we will see that it is a big mistake for the US to rely exclusively on international suppliers for critical medical equipment and pharmaceuticals. And I would expect to see immense political pressure to have those supply chains relocalized back to the US to some degree. There will also be pressure on other supply chains like electronics and so forth. Those will be harder to move, but anything relating to pharma or medical equipment, yes, I think we will see those rebuilt in the United States, and I think we'll see significant stockpiles built. So there's another question in the Q&A which relates to this. You know, what do I see as the result of supply chains? You know, and you know, I think I've mainly addressed it. The key point is that there's certain kinds of supply chains which I think will have to move back for national security reasons. Others, perhaps less so. If you talk to Apple, for example, they're very impressed at how China handled the COVID-19 epidemic. And so they're even more reluctant to move their supply chain out of China because they know if something bad happens in China, it's dealt with quickly, whereas if they go to Vietnam or India or somewhere else, they have much less confidence. So I think the supply chain issue is going to be very complicated, and the things that will move most are the ones that are directly related to national security. Next question is, can the Chinese economy recover with the global economy in its knees, and will this push China to become even more independent of global supply chains? Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is if the global economy is in recession, that's going to make it really tough for China. So they're going to have a rough time the rest of the year. This will encourage them to reduce their dependence on the rest of the world, but that's tough. The reality is that China depends critically on enormous amounts of key inputs from the rest of the world. They depend enormously on global markets. So I think politically in both the US and China, there is kind of a desire, oh, we should be more independent, we should decouple. But when you look at what's actually involved in decoupling on a large scale, not just here and there in individual sectors, it's staggering. And I personally, I just don't think it's realistic to do a complete return to localized production chains. So it's going to be a very messy story over the next few years as people figure out what they can be independent in and where dependency is really unavoidable. Okay, next question is, United States and China have been competing to have the world's biggest economy. If China is able to restart earlier than the US, will this finally unseat the US and make China the greatest global economic power? Simple answer to that, no. China's economy is about 2/3 the size of the United States. I will point out that 10 years ago, after the global financial crisis, The Economist magazine published a prediction that China's economy would be bigger than the United States by now, 2019. And they were off by a small matter of $7 trillion because that was essentially a straight line extrapolation from present. It understated the resilience of the US economy. It overstated the ability of China to maintain double-digit growth rates forever. I think that this is clearly, like the global crisis, this is a major blow for US prestige because clearly we mishandled this in a pretty massive way. And it's clearly a big blow to the economy. But China has a lot of problems of its own. They were heading into a structurally much lower growth era. They are critically reliant on many kinds of U.S. technology that the Trump administration now wants to, reduce those flows. And they have, horrific demographics. It's a very aging society. In 20 years, China's society will be older than Japan's is today, and substantially older than the United States. So I think this clearly is going to be a problem in terms of US prestige and relative power in the world, but I think it is way too early to make these larger predictions about a major shift in the overall balance. I think despite all of the enormous difficulties that we face today, the resources and resilience of the US should not be underestimated. Next question is, are the perspectives of USAID and the State Department consistent and collaborative, or do you see a rift within these entities that makes messaging even more difficult? Well, I wouldn't pick those as the two agencies to focus on, but the underlying question is, are we getting mixed and confusing messages from different US government agencies about this issue and about the US-China relationship? Absolutely. It is chaos. There is no national strategy at the top level for how to deal with China. There are a lot of different competing views, some very hardline ones and some much more moderate ones, particularly at the Treasury and the economic agencies. And this is a real problem in general for US-China relations because there is no consistent message, there's no consistent strategy, there's almost random different things happening. And it's also a big problem at this moment because what you need is a coordinated response from the US and an ability for the coordinators in the US to meet with the coordinators in China and say, okay, how do we handle this problem? And you don't have that. So I would say that the lack of coordination in this administration is 10 times or 100 times worse than the lack of coordination that you ordinarily see in any administration, and that this is particularly toxic for the US-China relationship, managing that on all its dimensions, and managing the epidemic response and the necessary coordination with China. So there are reports showing that low-level officials in China have told firms to embellish their recoveries by turning on idle equipment to boost energy usage. How do we know that the recovery statistics from the Chinese government are true? Yeah, good question. Answer, we do our best. We look at all different sources of data. And that's why we say that today China is operating maybe at about 75% of capacity. If you look at the government data, they will claim that, oh, it's close to 100%, because they count every company that has reopened as 100% reopened, right? But if you've reopened and you're operating at 10% of your pre-epidemic capacity, that's not 100%, that's 10%, right? So when we look at the data that we can find and the high frequency data that's very granular and less subject to manipulation, a lot of activity is returning. And I talk to my staff, several times a week in Beijing, and they report that in many dimensions, life in Beijing, for example, seems to be much closer to normal than it was a couple of weeks ago. So we are seeing a recovery, but yeah, I think the top line official data on this need to be treated with a lot of suspicion. Next question is, how is China's scientific community collaboration viewed internally within China? That's a good question. I don't know how it's seen within China. I think outside China, basically they're getting pretty high marks. Chinese scientists were sharing data very early on. They sequenced the coronavirus genome very early on. This has enabled a very rapid ramp up of research into treatments and vaccines. And so there have been a lot of problems with scan of the scientific papers that are being posted on the Lancet amount of Chinese contributions to this at a pretty high level. So broadly speaking, I think the scientific level within China is very strong and a very important component of a global response. And again, the concern that I would have is that sort of technical expertise and contribution can be messed up by politics if we're not careful. So I see there are a couple of, there's one question that came in on the chat, so please don't send by chat, go to the Q&A function. Yeah, so there's a question about, okay, we've seen a lot of viruses popping out of China, SARS, avian influenza, and so forth. This one, what can we do about this? The answer is, I think a lot of people who look at epidemics, there are a lot of books that have been written about this, say, you know what, we're a densely populated world with a lot of people in contact with animals, there are going to be epidemics, right? There's no way that you can stop epidemics from happening. We have to devise systems that are able to respond to these effectively. I think that's the basic answer. I think within China, there are some clear policy things that could be done. And the most obvious is that it seems likely that both the SARS and this epidemic had their origins in live animal markets, where there was close contact between all kinds of different species and people. And this provides an opportunity for viruses to jump from other species to ours. I think it's quite likely that we will see the Chinese government, move to shut down all of these live animal markets throughout China. I think the party realizes that they're going to need to do that for their own security, never mind the security of the world. And I think that will help. And I think, but the other thing is, like, we should obviously think about ways to prevent epidemics from occurring. But the central thing is, as much as we try, we are guaranteed to fail every so often. So it is crucial to have resilient, redundant response mechanisms in place. And these have to be coordinated internationally. It doesn't do any good, as we've learned now, if one country does a good job and everyone else messes it up. Even if one other country messes it up, it can affect everyone. So coordination is really important. Okay, Courtney, I have a few more questions here. How long do you want to keep this going? You're on mute. Courtney, you need to unmute yourself. I see you.
Yes, learning. Yes, I think we should probably stop taking new questions, but okay. I think if people want to, if we want to wrap up some of these last ones, and for example, I think you just, and I apologize for I'm on my phone, so I'm trying to check out the Q&A.
Yeah,
I think you did just answer the last question that came in, which is
yeah,
basically about government response
that's right.
to global pandemics.
So we have,
But maybe you want to take a
yeah,
stab
so we
at
have,
a few of the
okay,
other
so we have
ones.
two other questions in the queue, which I will answer. Um, one is, do you think that China will adhere to its phase one trade deal with the US? And what is the Chinese sort of view of the US political leadership? The hard to say, given that everything has been thrown into disarray by the coronavirus. First of all, it was very difficult to understand what the Chinese commitments actually were under the phase one trade deal, because all of the line items about what they were supposed to buy were kept secret. So there was a big, and analysts like myself that were kind of trying to piece it together were having a big problem. So what exactly their commitments were is not at all clear. And well, I think what is clear is their ability to massively change their economic structure or buying patterns under these kinds of circumstances is a lot less. So I think basically the whole trade deal thing, that is on ice until much later in the year, when there's some semblance of normality in both the US and the Chinese economies, and then we'll see. And the other question is, what do the Chinese think about the Trump leadership? Obviously, I think they don't like it, and they find it very difficult to understand because, as I mentioned earlier, it's very chaotic. You talk to different people, you get different messages. But I think the key point is that the Chinese leadership has concluded that the US has pretty much made a decision to treat China as an adversary, much more hostile. And so this is a new reality that China needs to adapt to. And so they need to be much more self-reliant and much more aggressive internationally at promoting their own message and trying to get allies and friends to help them push back against what they see as an overly aggressive US response. And then the final question, which is a nice place to end, is, has the Thucydides trap thesis of incumbent rising power dynamics now become mainstream among US-China analysts? And where do you see the academic consensus going the next 10 years? My personal view on this is much less deterministic. I think, not to get too geeky about, when you dive into the sort of details of this Thucydides trap argument, it's one of those things that seems very appealing at the conceptual level, and then when you look at it, it begins to fall apart. And the simplest way I have of thinking about this, which is, I alluded to this earlier, is if you look at the relationship, the interdependence between the US and the Chinese economies, this has no precedent in world history, right? And I have 1,000 charts I could show you. And if you show China and US interdependence versus US and the Soviet Union back in the Cold War, they are different galaxies, right? There are 70,000 US companies operating in China with somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 or $400 billion in fixed assets and over $500 billion of annual sales in China. Let alone the trade flows, the technology flows, research collaborations. We have never seen anything like this in the history of the world. So yes, there's a rivalry there, but there is also a level of deep interdependence on many, many dimensions for which we have no analog in world history, none, not even close. So the notion that you can apply a highly schematic and pretty stylized view of great power relations from centuries in the past and say, okay, that's where we're heading now, to me, that is, not to put too fine a point on it, I think it's ridiculous. There are elements of it that are true. I mean, the rivalry is definitely strengthening. As I mentioned, there is this zero-sum logic that is beginning to grab the political elites, both in the US and in China. But that zero-sum logic hits up against these very powerful realities of economic interdependence, which are not zero sum. They are win-win. There's a positive sum thing there. So I think what's interesting and difficult is that we have zero sum ideas which are powerful coming up against an equally powerful positive sum reality, and how do they interact? So I don't buy the simplistic view of that argument. I do think that we are heading into a very dangerous period in relationships that requires much more sophisticated management, frankly, on both sides. And I hope that that is what we start to get in the coming years.
Okay, well, I think with that, you know, I think we probably went over time, although I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of the questions. But Arthur, thank you very much. To everyone that was listening in, thank you for you know, bearing with us as we learn the ropes of this. You know, Network 2020 will be doing, you know, I think right now we're doing about 2 calls a week. Our next call is on Monday, and that's on Russia, Turkey, and power in the Middle East. And then we have one on a week from now, I believe, which is also on coronavirus and basically the new normal and what an international response can look like, and that's with Jamie Metzel. So, Arthur, thank you so much. Thank you for all your work. For, you know, everyone that's on, you can find out about an RSVP to future calls on our website, www.network2020.org. And everyone, please stay safe wherever you are. And we will be circulating a survey after this, and so we'd appreciate it if you're able to fill that out, because it will help us improve these calls as we learn the ropes. So thank you. And Arthur, we really appreciate it. You know, I'm sure if we could all clap, we would all be clapping. So okay. You'll have to do without the applause, okay. but have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, bye-bye.